CWA, along with dozens of other labor unions and social justice organizations, are fighting to build worker power by building union power. This is an important moment in history. We have a chance to win real worker power for millions of people. It will take everyone in this room and tens of thousands more workers to come together and fight to take power from the 1%. Today we'll cover how workers are fighting back, take a look at the state of the labor movement in this country, learn about the two major legislative bills we are pushing in Congress, the opportunities and challenges for passage, and how you can get involved. In the last few years, we have seen an upsurge in workers uniting to fight back against the 1% and win. We have an opening right now to build real union power in our country. It's important to understand what workers are willing to do to fight, what employers try to throw in their way, and the laws and policies that make it hard for workers. Now we'll take a look at two examples of workers using one of the most powerful tools of collective action, the strike. One from CWA and one from outside of CWA. Workers in the South who live and work in some of the most anti-union, anti-worker states are fighting back. On August 24, 2019, 20,000 AT&T workers across 9 southeastern states went on an unfair labor practice, or a ULP strike. When employers commit an action that is illegal under labor law, employees have the right to strike. In this case, the workers filed charges against AT&T because they sent people to the bargaining table who didn't have the authority to make proposals or to reach an agreement and change the agreement about how the union and the company met and bargained. The ULP strike lasted for 5 days. Striking workers protested outside of call centers, garages, and AT&T stores. They generated national media attention and support from other labor and community organizations. On August 28, the union's bargaining team reached a handshake deal to settle negotiations ending the strike. It took a few more days to get the tentative agreement because the union wanted to ensure that every single issue that had been discussed was properly documented and there was no confusion about its meaning or intent. CWA members ratified the contract on October 1, 2019. The new agreement provided a 5-year contract, a 13.25% wage increase, increased job security for core employees, improvements to monitoring language for call center employees, seniority protections, and other upgrades for wire technicians. Our second strike example comes from 450,000 teachers striking for better and fair pay. In February 2018, around 43,000 teachers and other school employees across West Virginia struck to demand fairer wages and protest chronic disinvestment in public schools. After shutting down schools for 9 days, they received a commitment for a 5% pay raise. Then in February 2019, teachers went on strike again to stop legislation that tied their pay raise to new charter schools and tax breaks for private schools. After a 2-day strike, teachers successfully killed the legislation, and they continue to mobilize for acceptable legislation that would deliver their promised 5% raise. In West Virginia, public school employees have no legal right to strike or even to bargain collectively. Teachers walked off the job anyway. They could have been fined or fired, but public support was too broad. Since then, more than 400,000 teachers have walked off their jobs, including tens of thousands in unlikely states like Kentucky, Oklahoma, Arizona, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Students, parents, and other school workers have joined teachers on picket lines and at massive protests at state capitals. Public higher education workers organized following the footsteps of state employees who in the 1980s, without formal bargaining rights in Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri, organized with CWA on a mass scale and won pay raises and other worker protections. State university and college workers across titles including instruction, research, and academic support, to service, maintenance, clerical, and technical, are organizing to form unions. Workers are calling for living wage and paid leave for all workers, hazard pay for essential workers, flexible grading options for instructors, protection for contingent faculty, and protection of vulnerable students during the pandemic. United Campus Workers, which are CWA members, have locals and chapters all across the South. They're including states Arizona, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Georgia, Kentucky, South Carolina, and Virginia. Also, locals and chapters have formed in Colorado and Michigan. Currently, UCW, CWA members do not have the legal right to bargain with their employers, but they have successfully won fights, including stopping of outsourcing of thousands of facility services workers across Tennessee's public higher education institutions, to winning across-the-board pay raises for employees and raises in base pay to bring campus workers closer to a living wage, stopped harassment from abusive supervisors, and changed the culture of many other workplaces and departments. Tech workers at Google are fighting to form a union. The Alphabet Workers Union, which is part of CWA, publicly launched in January 2021 with about 400 workers. The workers have decided to unionize, but not under the National Labor Relations Board certification. Typically, unions are formed after an election conducted by the NLRB, the agency responsible to enforce U.S. labor law. If the majority of voters choose to join, the NLRB certifies the union to represent the workers and bargain collectively with their employer. However, after decades of corporate takeover of the NLRB, the board narrowly defines work groups limited by the type of worker or location, which would make it easier for Alphabet, Google's parent company, to fight back the workers' efforts. The Alphabet Workers Union is fighting to end unfair labor practices, including cyberbullying, sexism, and racism within the company, and stop unethical business deals. Workers are expecting aggressive pushback by Google, given that in 2019 the company hired a union-busting firm to preemptively stop activism of workers. AWU's membership has more than doubled during the short time since they went public, and now has passed the 1,000 member mark. Even though a lot of workers are organizing and fighting right now, even though the labor movement has high popularity among public opinion, the labor movement has less power now than at other times in our past. Next, we'll take a look at what's going on. Overall, 10.5% of American workers are union members. In the private sector, union membership is lower now than at any other point since the 1930s. In the public sector, unionization has remained high because government employers have, for the most part, respected workers' rights. However, that rate has now begun to decline because of increased attacks on public sector unions. The Supreme Court decision in Janus v. AFS CME allows public employees to become free riders who benefit from union representation without having to help pay for it. Janus v. AFS CME was a Supreme Court case that ruled public sector employees around the nation will no longer have to pay fees or dues to their unions, even if those unions collectively bargain on behalf of those employees, impacting union membership and revenues nationwide. As we see in this slide, the actual raw numbers tell the real story. Union decline continues to spiral down. Take a moment to look at this chart. It shows the number of work stoppages has dropped drastically since the 1970s. At the height of the labor movement in 1952, there were 470 work stoppages. In 2019, there were only 25. Last year, during the pandemic, there were only 8 major work stoppages. Because of the way the data is collected, the chart includes both strikes and lockouts and only covers stoppages involving 1,000 or more workers. Currently, there are 27 states, including Alabama, who have what is known as right-to-work laws. Under these so-called right-to-work laws, workers at a unionized employer don't have to pay any portion of union dues. Supporters claim that without these laws, workers are forced into unions, and that restricts their right to work. But the real goal here is to undercut union numbers and union dollars, and sadly, it's been highly effective. These so-called right-to-work laws should be called what they are: free rider laws that give workers union-negotiated wages, benefits, and protections without paying any share of the costs of bargaining and enforcing the contract. The alternative is fair share. All workers at a union employer pay their fair share of the union's cost to negotiate their contract and represent them. No one is ever required to be a member of the union. Originally, the movement to pass right-to-work laws was to keep Jim Crow, or segregation, in the workplace. Vance Muse from Texas led a propaganda campaign through the Christian American Association on behalf of corporate interests in the South, helping pass the first state laws in Arkansas and Florida in 1944. His main drive was to keep black and white workers separate and ensure black workers were kept in second-class status, working with poverty wages, poor working conditions, and no legal protections. In 1947, Congress, over a veto by President Truman, allowed states to pass free rider laws. Within a year, 12 states passed free rider laws, following by 6 more in the 1950s. After that, each decade brought one new law at most. But since 2012, anti-unionists have tried to start a new wave of free rider laws and succeeded in 6 states, including union stronghold states Wisconsin and Michigan, as well as Indiana. Missouri passed a free rider law in 2017. However, before it went into effect, it was put to a referendum, and Missouri voters rejected it by an overwhelming 67%. CWA played a huge role in this fight, and we are very proud to have defeated right to work in Missouri. Now let's take a look at the state of public sector workers. Public employees were left out of the Wagner Act. In the 1950s and 60s, after workers, mostly black and Latino, organized and with strong public support, state and local governments were forced to adopt labor laws. But they were not the same collective bargaining agreements that existed in the private sector. Nowadays, it's a hodgepodge of laws that cover public sector workers. Most states, as you see in shaded blue, do not have comprehensive bargaining laws. Some of these states have laws covering various groups of employees, and in some states, localities have passed their own laws. The light green states of Kansas and Maryland have different levels. Kansas law covers local government only if they opt in. In Maryland, there are no state laws covering local employees, but the largest localities have their own laws. The green-colored states provide collective bargaining to a majority of public employees by law. Comprehensive bargaining law means workers have collective power to negotiate for higher wages, employer-covered health care, and benefits like paid sick days and paid vacations. In some cases, they have the right to strike. In fact, public workers with collective bargaining can earn between 10.7 and 13.6% more than non-unionized workers. This is based on a project between the Economic Policy Institute and AFS-CME in 2017. Now let's take a look at another problem, the difficulty of bargaining a first contract. The right to enter into collective bargaining doesn't guarantee actually reaching a bargaining agreement. Quite the opposite. Even though it's really hard to win a union campaign, let's say you win, hooray! But then you're faced with the next hurdle, negotiating a first contract. We all know the contract is the codified heart and strength of the union. A contract spells out your rights, your wages, benefits, and rules around the workplace. As you can imagine, if the boss is fighting the workers to unionize, they're most likely to continue the fight when it comes to bargaining. Even if workers make it through a hostile employer campaign, it can take years before a union ever obtains a first contract. Some never do. The reasons include the absence of meaningful penalties against employers who bargain in bad faith, and the fact that employers have the legal right to fire striking workers. Cornell researcher Kate Brofenbrenner studied a representative sample of hundreds of NLRB representation elections and found that many of the unions that won representation were never able to bargain a first contract. As shown in the chart, a majority of organized units had no collective bargaining agreement 1 year after the election. Within 2 years, more than one-third still had no contract, and by 3 years that portion was still around 30%. For example, 100 technicians and warehouse workers at Dish TV organized with CWA. They won their elections and were certified by the NLRB in 2009. However, the workers still do not have a first contract 12 years later. Dish TV hired anti-union law firm Jackson Lewis and led an aggressive campaign against workers. including legal delays like trying to decertify the union and illegal intimidation from management and cutting wages and health care coverage for the workers. The NLRB stepped in 9 years later, ordering Dish TV to rehire workers who had been forced to quit, provide health care, pay back wages, and return to the negotiating table. Management responded by announcing layoffs of current workers to hire the reinstated former employees, blaming the union, the NLRB, and withheld raises for unionized staff. In 2021, Dish TV has continued efforts to undermine the workers' rights to a contract and has not reached an agreement. Collective bargaining rights give workers power at the workplace. It is a process in which working people, through their unions, negotiate contracts with their employers to determine their terms of employment, including pay, benefits, hours, leave, job health and safety policies, ways to balance work and family, and more. Workers in many other countries enjoy greater collective bargaining rights than U.S. workers. The United States' 12% collective bargaining coverage ranks last among democracies shown. So how did we get here? In this section, we'll take a tour through the history of labor law reforms that bludgeoned the labor movement. During the New Deal era in the mid-1930s, there was a flurry of pro-labor laws passed. The Wagner Act, formerly named the National Labor Relations Act, passed in 1935. The Wagner Act transformed the lives of millions of workers. It gave workers the right to form and join a union, forced employers to collectively bargain with the union, set up majority rule vote to form a union, and created the National Labor Relations Board as the enforcing agency for workers' rights. It was passed in response to the militancy of the labor movement and industrial unrest. The labor movement was organized, militant, and waged key strikes, win or lose, that led to such significant labor unrest the government had to respond. Following the passage of the bill, both union membership and the size of the U.S. economy would grow hand in hand, so that by 1945 the ranks of unionized workers had reached a record 35% of the non-agricultural workforce, while wages had increased by 65% and unemployment fell to less than 1%. However, since industries like agriculture and domestic work were left out, people of color and women didn't necessarily share in the prosperity the same way as white male workers. But overall, it did significantly raise the standards of living, even for many workers of color and women. But this progress was short-lived. Backlash from the business community was swift and aggressive. They used their political clout to successfully push for legislation, including the Taft-Hartley Act, to significantly weaken labor law protections. Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act over President Truman's veto in 1947. The law created right to work, narrowed what could be considered an unfair labor practice, and banned secondary strikes, so it became unlawful for a union to strike a business with which it does not have a direct dispute over wages or working conditions. A union also cannot encourage any individual to engage in a secondary strike. For example, during the 2016 Verizon strike, the union could put out a flyer that read, "Don't buy Verizon phones at Walmart," but the union could no longer say, "Don't shop at Walmart because it carries Verizon phones." It took significant economic pressure points away from workers. But that was not all. Various Supreme Court decisions weakened labor law protection further. For example, in one 1938 court ruling, employers gained the right to permanently replace striking workers. The impact of this decision was felt in the 1980s and 90s when it discouraged millions of workers from going on strike. One example is the Michigan 1995 strike of 2,500 workers at the Detroit Free Press and Detroit News, members of the Newspaper Guild, Typographical Union, and Teamsters. After negotiations broke down over issues of merit pay and job security, workers walked off the job and the conflict turned violent at the newspaper's printing plant in Sterling Heights. Strikers participated in civil disobedience, organized advertising and subscription boycotts, published an alternative weekly strike paper, and organized massive solidarity from other unions in the area. In response, Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News hired replacement workers, and management spent an estimated $40 million on private security forces to protect their facilities. After the 19-month strike, more than 200 strikers were fired and several hundred remained locked out. Management offered jobs to a handful of striking workers and kept permanent replacements on the payroll. The PATCO strike of 1981 was a turning point in the labor movement. We know the 1% and politics were intertwined, but this moment solidified the relationship between the corporate elite and politicians and undermined the bargaining power of workers. About 13,000 members of the professional air traffic controllers walked off their job in response to unsuccessful contract negotiations regarding working conditions, pay, and benefit demands. While this technically violated a 1955 law banning strikes for government unions, several other government unions had previously struck without penalty. There were 39 illegal work stoppages against the federal government between 1962 and 1981. In fact, at the time, there were on average 300 major work stoppages per year. President Ronald Reagan ordered the workers back. 11,345 workers remained on strike, while a couple of thousand returned to work. Reagan then fired the 11,345 striking workers who did not return to work and prevented them from ever being rehired by the FAA. It signaled to the business class that strike breaking and the use of permanent replacements was now the new norm, which had been legal before then but never really used. Within months, PATCO was decertified, and it signaled to all politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, a new way to handle labor. Clinton signed NAFTA and CAFTA over the objections of the labor movement. Obama pushed TPP, although the entire labor movement was against it. These trade deals and other anti-labor laws further weakened the labor movement. But that was not enough. Companies looked for other ways to prevent activism in the workplace and stop workers from forming unions. Union-busting companies became the go-to for employers when faced with organizing drives. The big jump was in the 1970s. In the 60s, there were only about 100 firms, and by the 80s, there were at least 1,000 firms, a tenfold increase. The union-busting industry is worth several $100 million per year. In a December 2019 report by the Economic Policy Institute, they estimate that companies spend $340 million a year on anti-union consultants, some of whom charge more than $350 per hour or more than $2,500 per day. Consultants have played a central role in the development of many tactics that have become standard features of every anti-union campaign, including customized videos and websites, vote committees, and anti-union campaign literature. According to studies by Kate Brofenbrenner at Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations, employers can cut union win rates in half by using such tactics. They often specialize in particular industries such as healthcare, gaming, hospitality, publishing, nonprofit, and education, or in dealing with particular groups of workers such as Latinos, African Americans, or women. Union busting is legal, and employers can deduct expenses from their taxes. Since 1986, anti-union management consultants have been hired in about 3/4 of elections to break up union organizing drives. Employers deem their activities to fall under the advice exemption and can deduct the anti-union busting expenses from their taxes. As long as workers have been organizing, employers have launched offensives against them. Before protections granted in the Wagner Act, corporate America had been responding to the building labor movement by massive violence, including employing their own police force. For example, in the early 1930s, the Ford Motor Company employed the largest private army in the entire world. Once the Wagner Act passed, corporations found other ways to retaliate against workers and used loopholes in labor laws to their advantage. For example, unions are denied physical access to the workplace during an organizing campaign, but employers are permitted to compel employee presence for captive audience meetings. A comprehensive study was undertaken in 2009 that found workers were forced to attend anti-union one-on-one sessions with a supervisor at least weekly in 75% of elections. In 63% of elections, employers use supervisor one-to-one meetings to interrogate workers about who they or other workers supported, and in 54% used such sessions to threaten workers. In almost 34% of union election campaigns, workers are fired. In 57% of unionization campaigns, employers make illegal threats to close all or parts of a plant. In 47% of elections, employers threaten to cut wages and benefits. That study also found that the intensity of employer opposition has been increasing. From the 1990s to the early aughts, the likelihood of private employers using 10 or more tactics in their anti-union campaigns doubled, and the focus on more coercive and punitive tactics designed to intensely monitor and punish union activity increased. Yet both the NLRA's enforcement and penalties are insufficient to either deter, prevent, or punish employers from waging war against organizing workers. We see this every day in our organizing fights. For example, workers at iMart Express, eyewear retail and e-commerce company, organized with IUE, CWA for a living wage, pathway to promotion, and open door policy to have their voice heard in 2020. At one Missouri store with 8 workers during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic breakout, the company sent 5 executives from out of state to intimidate and harass workers. Workers had to deal with daily mandatory meeting during work hours to hear anti-union rhetoric, like "we will close the store if you vote for a union," and "we will want to give you a raise, but we can't because of the union." The CEO of the company even took workers out for dinner and drinks, making promises for a no vote. This chart shows that a gap has developed between productivity and real wages. Productivity measures how much we produce in a given hour. In general, in a productive economy, we collectively have the knowledge, skill, technology, and organization to produce more each hour. Real wages is what we earn after taking inflation into account. For generations, as productivity, or the top red line, increased, so did wages, the bottom blue line. As we can see, post-World War II until the mid-1970s, productivity and wages were virtually inseparable. Average workers shared in the rewards of higher productivity. In the mid-1970s, something changed. Productivity kept going up, but our wages didn't. Today, we produce 2.5 times more goods and services per hour of labor than we did in 1947. Yet average wages have stalled since the mid-1970s. Had we continued to get our fair share of productivity gains, the average American worker's wage would have been $1,377 per week in 2018. That's almost double the actual wage of $746. Workers have faced 3 major economic changes since the 1970s that have led to the decline of the labor movement and worker power. Deindustrialization caused the decline of the manufacturing workforce. Millions of workers lost their jobs after companies shut down factories, automated jobs, downsized, or moved to the mostly non-union South where it was cheaper, all to make more in profit. Places like the Midwest, western Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and many towns across New England saw the direct impact of the factory closures. The U.S. manufacturing workforce fell from around 40% during the post-World War II era to just over 13% today, which was mostly in unionized industries. We still see it today. The documentary The Last Truck tells the story of what happened in Dayton, Ohio when thousands of IUE CWA members lost their jobs as General Motors closed its doors. The ripple effect was devastating for the entire region. In addition to the GM jobs that were lost, tens of thousands of other jobs were lost farther down the supply chain at other shops in the area that made component parts. Local restaurants and other small businesses had to close their doors when their customers lost their jobs, and 13 years later, the local economy still hasn't recovered from these closures. The rise of globalization. With advanced technology and corporate-backed trade deals like NAFTA and CAFTA, companies took advantage of weak labor and environmental laws in other countries and moved their factories out of the U.S. It further hurt workers in the U.S. and exploited workers in other countries who do not have the same labor protections. According to a report by the Economic Policy Institute, NAFTA alone resulted in 682,900 jobs lost between 1993 and 2010. CWA employers like AT&T have outsourced or moved 12,000 call center jobs to other countries. Financialization of the economy happened when Wall Street was deregulated and given free rein. They instituted a new business model. Instead of putting profits back into workers, research, and development, companies used their profits to buy back stocks to make money for their CEOs and shareholders. We see the impact on CWA members and consumers every day. For example, Verizon bought $5 billion in stock back in 2015 instead of investing in the workers. broadband infrastructure, and service quality. They tried to cut health care, remove job security from the contract, and push more jobs outside of the U.S. during the bargaining fight with 40,000 CWA members. CWA members went on strike against the company and won. And of course, we are in the midst of more changes with the rise of the gig economy and the employers finding new ways to make profit on the backs of working people. When CEOs and the 1% hold so much power, our economy and laws stay rigged in their favor. They get richer while our wages stay stagnant and our working conditions get worse. We need big change. Remember these photos from earlier in the presentation? Workers are fighting back. We have seen the power of workers. When workers organize, mobilize, and strike together, we can build power and win the wages, benefits, and working conditions we need and deserve. But it's time for the laws to catch up. We are organizing to pass two game-changing pieces of legislation that will shift power to workers: the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or also known as the PROACT, and the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act. CWA and allies succeeded in getting the PROACT passed in the House in February 2020 and again this year with bipartisan support. We hope to pass the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act this year too. Now let's find out what exactly is the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PROACT. The Protecting the Right to Organize, or PROACT, is historic legislation that will put power in the hands of workers and reverse decades of legislation meant to crush unions. The bill will completely change labor law as we know it and shift power from CEOs to workers. The bill was passed with bipartisan support in early March and introduced in the Senate with 45 sponsors. PROACT would strengthen the National Labor Relations Act in multiple ways. First, it bans unfair anti-union activities. It prohibits one of the most common employer tactics for stopping an organizing drive, forcing workers to attend mandatory anti-union meetings. Next, it creates penalties and remedies for illegal retaliation like firing workers for organizing. It would impose penalties against employers, including officers and directors, and pay damages to workers. Importantly, this would apply regardless of a worker's immigration status, which employers try to use to divide workers. Employers routinely fire and retaliate against pro-union workers because they know it will undermine the organizing campaign. While that's currently illegal, there are no penalties for employers. Illegally fired workers wouldn't have to wait years for their case to be resolved. The NLRB can go to court and get an injunction to immediately reinstate workers for illegal retaliation. It also requires employers to disclose what they pay to union-busting companies they hire to stop workers from organizing. And it prevents misclassification of employees as independent workers and supervisors. Employers define workers as independent contractors and supervisors to get around workers' rights protections. Employers like Uber, Lyft, and other gig companies have made a fortune by misclassifying workers as independent contractors. Telecom companies and other industries do it as well. Let's say you call AT&T to install broadband in your home. Instead of getting an AT&T technician covered by a CWA contract installing your service, the customer gets a subcontractor who AT&T considers an independent contractor, but wears the same AT&T uniform and must follow AT&T directives when it comes to hours, schedule, working conditions, and scope of work. The subcontractor may not have the same training, doesn't receive the same pay, benefits, or legal protections like minimum wage or overtime, and doesn't have the ability to collectively bargain as the CWA union workers. But the subcontractor is a lot cheaper for the phone company, so more profit for AT&T or Verizon. The PROACT would strengthen the definition so that millions of workers have the same protections and right to unionize. The PROACT would strengthen the right to bargain. Time and time again, even after workers have voted to form a union, employers stall and distract to prevent them from ever reaching a first contract. This means that workers have a union, but none of the protections that come with having a contract. Earlier, we talked about Dish TV's refusal to bargain a first contract, but this happens often. When CWA members formed a union at Cablevision in 2012, it took more than 3 years to secure a first contract. Hundreds of News Guild CWA members are fighting right now to secure their first contract at news organizations across the country. The PROACT fixes this by establishing a process for workers to request mediation and then binding arbitration if necessary if an agreement hasn't been reached within 90 days of bargaining. Free rider right-to-work laws force unions to let workers who don't pay dues freeload off workers who do. The PROACT wouldn't overturn free rider laws passed by states, but would allow unions to bargain a fair share clause in their contracts that would override free rider laws. Fair share would require all workers who are covered by and benefit from the collective bargaining agreement to contribute a fair share fee towards the cost of bargaining and administering the agreement. Finally, the PROACT protects the power to strike. The right to strike is fundamental to worker power, but court decisions have dramatically undermined this right by allowing employers to permanently replace strikers. The PROACT adds duration, scope, frequency, or intermittence of any strike or strikes shall not render such strike or strikes unprotected or prohibited. Current law prohibits secondary strikes and boycotts against companies that can put economic pressure on the worker's employer, even if these companies hold real sway over the employer and could help settle the dispute. The PROACT would allow for secondary strikes, boycotts, and picketing, and removes any penalties for unions that exercise their rights to secondary strikes. The PROACT prohibits employers from permanently replacing striking workers and from discriminating against employees who supported or participated in a strike. As folks may remember from a few slides back, employers have worked really hard to take away the power of the strike from workers and instill fear by retaliating against or firing striking workers. The second bill is the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act. The bill had over 225 co-sponsors in the House in the last Congress. We are expecting the bill to be introduced soon in the new Congress. As you may recall from earlier, public sector workers were left out of the Wagner Act, and in the 1970s fought to have bargaining rights. However, we learned that laws vary from state to state and sometimes city to city. The Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Bill sets a minimum nationwide standard for collective bargaining rights that all states must provide to public sector workers, state, county, and municipal. This will end the hodgepodge of laws that cover state and local public employees. It would allow workers to join a union selected by a majority, authorize the voluntary payroll deduction of union fees, and enable collective bargaining over wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment. In addition, the bill would ensure workers, through their unions, have a way to fight for their collective rights. It allows access to dispute resolution mechanisms such as mediation or arbitration. It prevents state and local governments from mandating rigged recertification elections, and it permits the filing of lawsuits in court to enforce their labor rights. For example, UCW-CWA workers have to organize campus by campus and rely on their state legislatures for better wages and benefits, job security, and safer working conditions. And there is no legal outlet if management at universities back out or change commitments, or there is turnover of state legislatures and the new leadership decides to revoke, end, or change agreements. The Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act would give workers legal protections to fight back. So you might be asking, what will it take? How can we make this happen? Let's talk about what we can do to make the PROACT law. Earlier this year, the House of Representatives passed the PROACT largely among party lines, with 1 Democratic no vote and 5 Republicans voting in favor. Now the fight has moved to the Senate, where we have some challenges and opportunities to pass the PROACT. Under the Constitution, passing a bill in the Senate takes only 51 votes. However, there is a Senate rule, never mentioned in the Constitution, that makes it harder to pass laws. That would be the filibuster. The filibuster rule requires that at least 60 senators agree to allow a bill to be voted on at all. The filibuster actually came about by accident. Until 1806, a Senate rule permitted a simple majority to allow a vote on a bill. In 1806, it appears that the rule was eliminated by mistake. Senators were merely cleaning up their rule book and didn't realize that they had opened the door to unlimited obstruction. The filibuster wasn't even used until 1837, 3 decades later. Today, the filibuster can happen in two forms: endless debate on the Senate floor or just the threat of endless debate. A senator can simply indicate his or her intention to filibuster a bill, and the bill stays in limbo unless there are 60 senators who will agree to bring it to the floor for a full vote. 60 senators must vote for cloture, which means closing the debate on a bill so it can be voted on by the full Senate. The practical effect of the filibuster is that 41 senators can stop a bill from becoming a law, even if it's supported by the majority. This gives huge leverage to the minority party because they can prevent their opponents from passing bills they don't like or force the majority to negotiate changes. The filibuster was a common tactic used by senators to block or delay civil rights legislation like anti-lynching, anti-poll tax, and the Civil Rights Act. It was used to stop worker power legislation including the 1978 Labor Law Reform Act and the 2007 Employee Free Choice Act. In 2020, the Chamber of Commerce and other pro-corporate groups campaigned against the PROACT when the House was debating the bill. They set up a website, wrote op-eds, ran a letter-writing campaign to legislators, ran ads, and organized their corporate members to defeat the PROACT. The National Retail Federation, which includes Walmart, Facebook, Target, Google, Macy's, and other big-box stores, called it the worst bill in Congress. In California, Uber, Lyft, and other gig companies spent $200 million last year to stop a pro-worker state bill that makes it harder for corporations to misclassify workers as independent workers and strips away their workers' rights, with similar language to that included in the PROACT. We expect the anti-worker, pro-corporate forces like National Right to Work Committee, Google, Amazon, Walmart, McDonald's, and others to go all out against the PROACT and spend billions to stop the bill. But we have the public on our side. Almost half of non-union workers, or 48%, say they would join a union if they could. That amounts to tens of millions of people. Overall, 65% of Americans approve of unions. As the chart shows, there's been a significant increase in approval in recent years. Support for unions is also high among the next generation of workers. 76% of the increase in union membership in 2017 was workers under the age of 35. Another way to pass the PROACT is through what's called the budget reconciliation process. The budget reconciliation is a special process created by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. As we just heard, the Senate requires 60 votes to pass any major legislation, but the budget reconciliation process only requires a majority vote. It is limited to taxes, spending, and debt limit. The process was used for welfare reform, parts of the Affordable Care Act, and the Bush and Trump tax cuts. There are 4 provisions of the PROACT that are reconcilable to build worker power. First, allow for members to deduct their union dues from their federal income taxes above the line, meaning they are automatically deductible whether you itemize your deductions or not. 2. Prevent businesses from deducting from their taxes business expenses incurred in fighting workers' efforts to unionize, hiring of striker replacements, and any other expenses used to fight the workers or their unions. 3. Through changes to the tax laws, employees would then have the right to form a union, collectively bargain, and receive benefits which currently as misclassified independent contractors they do not have. And 4. Civil penalties for unfair labor practices, including newly created ULPs. Employers will face penalties for violating federal labor laws. Ultimately, it will take many steps to pass the PROACT, and we will explore whatever options are available. But at the heart of it will be a big mobilization campaign. Our pathway to worker power includes many of the same tactics that helped us defeat TPP. We need to do it again and even bigger. Our plan includes building a massive coalition of both labor and non-labor organizations pushing together to build worker power. Education and mobilization campaigns of unionized and non-unionized workers. We need all CWA members to really understand the bills and doing everything possible to get them passed. And we need to target senators from both parties to stand with workers and not the bosses. And we have to be persistent. We are building national and state coalitions. We need labor, environmental, social justice, good government, religious organizations, retiree groups, and others to move and fight together. We know from history that labor grew when social justice movements and labor fought together for working people. We can't do this alone, and we need all working people's voices calling for change. We need to hold senators from both parties accountable. Here is the breakdown of our U.S. Senate targets. We have 4 Republicans who are likely to be in competitive elections next year in 2022. We have 3 Republicans who are not running for office again, who we also want to target. It'll send a message to anyone who ends up in those seats that they need to make worker power legislation part of their platform. On the Democratic side, we have 3 senators who are not supporting the PROACT yet. We need them to get it right. One of them, Mark Kelly in Arizona, is facing re-election in 2022. We need everyone involved. This is an all-hands-on-deck time. If the PROACT passes, it's going to be the most consequential reform for decades, not only for unions, but for all workers and for all working families. When workers have more power, wages go up. Standard of living goes up for everyone, which means better quality of life for everyone. If unions have more power, income inequality will be reduced, the power of corporations and bosses will be severely limited, and we're in a better position to fight for justice inside the workplace. Unions are still the biggest member-based organization in the country, and the stronger we are, the better we can fight. We can make it happen. This is going to be a long fight. We are not going to pass the PROACT in one fell swoop. It will take many steps, but we can absolutely make it happen. We are running presentations like this one across the country to CWA members and other allies. We are mobilizing members to push for the passage of the PROACT and Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act and move pro-worker provisions in the budget reconciliation process. We're building a coalition of labor unions and community organizations to build worker power and be ready to go up against the corporate pushback of these bills. We need to elect pro-worker legislators and defeat anti-worker legislators at the state and federal level.